This will induce a little bit of doubt in the minds of some, as well as just frankly embarrassing the system. And there are some movements going on behind the scenes at the moment where we're beginning to see military officers moved around, officials being picked up for corruption. I think there is unease in the Russian military system as to how effective they are. And even if this is a time-limited operation, the fact that they were able to move across the border, threaten a major area, do so publicly, capture Russian soldiers, it will just create, again, additional doubt in the Russian mind.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And this time we're joined by Matthew Savill. Matthew is the Director of Military Sciences at the London-based think tank RUSI. He focuses on developments and trends in modern conflict. And in his 20 years as a civil servant, he worked mainly at the Ministry of Defence. And in 2022, he was on the operations and crisis team in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's the afternoon of Thursday, the 8th of August, 2024. Matthew, welcome back to Frontline. Great to see you. Thank you for your time. Dramatic news has broken this week of a Ukrainian invasion into the Kursk region of Russia. What is your understanding of who is part of that attack and what has actually happened?
There's the usual caveats of that this is something that's developing fairly rapidly, and we're only about 48 hours into this. But it looks like what we have is a reasonably large Ukrainian operation involving forces from at least two brigades who have crossed the border into Kursk or Kursk Oblast in Russia, and are now sort of, if you like, spreading out. And thus far, they've captured a number of small villages. They appear to be in the outskirts of the town of Savill, and they've probably captured, or at least there's images of several hundred Russian troops who have been kind of caught up in this as prisoners of war.
President Putin is reported to have held an emergency meeting of his National Security Council, calling this a large-scale provocation. Do we know really how big it is at the moment, though?
I think it's difficult to know the exact size of it because some of this images have been filtering out. But it's, first of all, it looks like the first incursion of this scale using Ukrainian conventional forces into Russia. We've seen some previously from sort of proxies or Ukrainian-supported resistance forces, but there are at least two brigades here, the 22nd Mechanized and the 82nd Air Assault, where personnel have been identified from footage and from pictures. And it's certainly embarrassing for Russia at the moment. There were some signs in the initial reporting that they had basically said, well, we've got this situation under control, that we have repelled Ukrainian forces. And those messages have all now been deleted from Russian social media. And instead, they're sort of treating this as more of a crisis than an incident.
Major General Mick Ryan, who he often commentates on Frontline, has written an early assessment of the situation, and he talks about this multi-brigade operation with these quality brigades, the 22nd Mechanized Brigade and the 82nd Air Assault Brigade. I mean, if this is true, and if there are more to come, it's pointing to something quite different, isn't it?
I think potentially. I mean, again, it's difficult to know at the moment what the exact objectives are, and I think it's worth splitting those down into the sort of the military objectives, the tactical objectives, and what could be some significant political and presentational ones. On the ground, there are a number of potential explanations for what this is intended to do. I mean, it could be just an opportunity that opened up to go on to, conduct a counterattack, go on to the offensive, capture some prisoners of war for a later prisoner exchange. It could be linked to operations that are going on elsewhere that we don't know about or that are about to be launched. So, for example, there is some suggestion that there are lines of communication and supply lines that are going to the Russian forces that are on the Ukrainian side of the border around Kharkiv, and that if this operation proceeded far enough, it could threaten those sufficiently to cause them to draw back. It doesn't seem likely that Kursk itself, or for example, Kursk nuclear power station, are the targets, because some of those are 50 kilometers or more in. And that would be quite risky to insert Ukrainian forces and then try and sustain them inside Russian territory in the face of an inevitable Russia counterattack. But politically and presentationally, there's a couple of potential big wins here, depending on how this goes. And that's, first of all, a boost to Ukrainian morale, given that they've had quite a difficult year, and also showing to international backers that the Ukrainians are still in the fight. And that's particularly important with the US elections coming up.
Yeah, because as one national broadcaster in the UK said, Ukraine's back in the news.
Yes, and I think that there's a degree to which, if this captures headlines, embarrasses Putin, embarrasses the Russians, it somewhat reverses the narrative of what has been probably 6 months of very slow Russian gains. Although it's worth noting, at the moment, there are no signs that the Russians are having to divert forces from in or around the Donbass. And that situation there, particularly around Chasiv Yar and heading towards Pokrovsk, remains quite delicate and dangerous for the Ukrainians.
That's really interesting because those places you talk about are a long way from where this is happening in the Donbass. New York as well, Toretsk. Is it like you say there's no sign that Russian forces are having to be diverted? So do you think there is likely to be no impact of this invasion, either in the Ukraine's ability to defend there, or Russia's ability to continue its slow attritional advances?
Yes, I mean, this all assumes that the Russians are effectively coordinating well, and it's worth noting that they seem to have been caught on the hop here. That goes some way to suggesting that the Ukrainians have addressed some of the problems that they've had in operational security over the past 12 months. But the Russians should have sufficient reserves and forces to move those into the area to meet this raid. And in theory, it shouldn't affect what's happening further south, which remains their main objective and their main thrust. But of course, actually, over time, the Russians have shown both that their coordination of large operational forces has been far from perfect. A lot of what they're doing has been as a product of, if you like, brute force or massed numbers. And in terms of defenses in and around Russia, for example, air defenses, they have shown that they're under pressure there, given the losses that they're suffering all the way along the front line. And so one of the reasons that the Ukrainians continue to conduct some of those deep strike operations that they use drones for is that they can attack Crimea. They attack out to the east of Ukraine, so we've seen another airbase hit in the past week, and they attack deep into Russia, because that, in terms of air defense systems and forces behind the front lines, does pose some challenges to the Russians about where they place them.
And how were they able to catch the Russians on the hop here in Kursk?
So in this respect, that's we don't know at the moment, but that's an interesting area to delve into, perhaps some retrospective analysis of what was visible and what could be inferred from that. Because up until now, what we've been seeing is actually an increase in the level of surveillance that is possible over the battlefield. The Russians in particular have got a lot of small surveillance drones, and they have the upper hand at the moment in terms of what we call the transparency of the battlefield. And that's down to the fact that they are able to put so many over the battlefield that the Ukrainians are having to face difficult decisions about where and how they use their own ground-based air defenses. A lot of the really big systems with long ranges are needed to protect critical infrastructure and cities like Kyiv. And also it would be too expensive to use Patriots to take down medium-sized surveillance drones, let alone the very small loitering ones that the Russians use.
And in this attack, they are using highly mobile mechanized forces, a surprise, as we talked about, backed up with significant air defenses. The Institute for the Study of War, in its assessment on the 7th of August, it points to geolocated footage of the 6th and 7th, showing Ukrainian armoured vehicles advancing about 10 kilometres from the international border, with Ukrainian forces penetrating at least 2 Russian defensive lines and a stronghold. What can you tell us about the direction of the attack and why they've managed to cross and how they've managed to cross those defensive lines with apparent ease?
Well, I mean, it looks like they may have gone even further in overnight. So we're now looking at maybe 15 kilometers in some directions. It does appear in part that this has been a more lightly defended and more static part of the line, and so rather than facing the kind of heavy Russian defences, significant minefields, significant fortifications, with lots of artillery cover that we saw further to the south and to the east. They only faced, in the first instance, border guards and maybe sort of FSB ground forces rather than large conventional forces. I think there's an open question, maybe a bit too soon, to work out whether that is as a consequence of Russian complacency or maybe Ukrainian deception in terms of how they built up these forces. Possibly the Russians simply didn't expect it because the pressure that they're placing elsewhere and the fact that the Ukrainians, for their part, have had to rush forces around Kharkiv to deal with that buffer zone operation, which in itself has basically stalled. I mean, that's a good example of where the Ukrainian ability to use some Western supplied weapons over the border has now had an impact on Russian forces, and they've basically stemmed that advance and begun to turn it back.
If it is true that tanks are being used that have been supplied by NATO allies, armoured fighting vehicles as well, what do you read into the consequences politically of that, if that is the case, used in this invasion?
So there's certainly been some images of at least infantry fighting vehicles, so things like strikers. I think some of the German armoured vehicles have been seen as well. In some respect, what this does is expose some of the rhetoric that the Russians have used in the past about threats to Russian territory, which is that they haven't essentially gone over the top in terms of their initial reaction. Indeed, they still seem to be absorbing the operation to a certain degree. I think when the US in particular freed up its restrictions on artillery, both barrel, tube artillery, and some of the rocket artillery, what it was doing was reflecting the fact that that those weapons are being used to attack Russian forces in the close battle along the front line elsewhere in Ukraine, and that what was happening around Kharkiv was simply the same kind of battle, but it just so happened to straddle the international border. In essence, this is an extension of that. It's a conventional, relatively close range fight that just so happens to have the international border in the way. It's not clear whether the longer range weapons, cruise missiles like Storm Shadow or the US supplied ballistic missile ATACMS, would be usable in this struggle. But I think there's definitely an argument that will be made by some that the fact that this battle rages backwards and forwards demonstrates that fears of Russian escalation, whilst they should be taken seriously, are somewhat overblown in and around that close fight.
How long do you think it's going to be before it becomes apparent how long this advance is going to last? How long is it going to take before we actually get a better picture of what's really going on?
So a lot of that depends on, in essence, both the objectives and the speed at which the Russians muster an effective defense. Because you could see what was always intended to be something quite limited extend in duration if it turns out the Russians don't muster an effective defense. And then what happens is there's a significant opportunity here for the Ukrainians to effectively take more territory. I think the danger there is that sounds quite tempting, but if they haven't got the reserves or the ability to then stabilize a strong defensive position, what they'll have done is taken some quality forces, pushed them over the border, and then potentially overextended. So maybe another 48 or 72 hours, we'll have a good idea of the Russian response, and we might see Ukrainian consolidation and reserves moving up. I mean, some of that is the indications that we might see. Although if they've practiced effective camouflage and deception up until this point, they might be able to sort of hide that follow-up as well.
And do you think the Ukrainians actually have the forces to hold the ground?
I mean, it's always a bit difficult to sort of second guess them from 1,000 miles away. But the general view has been there is a manpower challenge for the Ukrainians with the current front lines. So the mobilization that they've taken place, the change in the conscription age, and the need to rebuild large, well-equipped counteroffensive forces for next year mean that you're unlikely to see a significant counteroffensive this year. And I should note, this isn't a significant counteroffensive, but it is a spoiler in Russian plans. So if you accept all of that's true, there is a risk here that the extension of the front lines in this way is not sustainable. And I think a lot of people would be concerned if the Ukrainians tried to do that. I mean, we've been wrong before, and so there's a note of caution in here. But generally, the view has been that no, they don't have the forces right now at the requisite level of quality and training and equipment to push that forward. It's worth noting, for example, that they would be well beyond the range of some of their longer ranged air defenses, which would be necessary to protect them against incoming Russian aircraft who could begin to pummel them with glide bombs of the kind that were used when the Kharkiv operation started. And they appear to have pushed up quite successfully their own FPV drones and smaller drones to strike Russian ground forces, and indeed some Russian helicopters, for example, that we've seen. But there is a genuine concern over whether or not they have enough of a defensive bubble against those incoming Russian aircraft that would be used. And I think it would be an enormous risk to try and push forward, for example, the F-16s that have just arrived in country this far into Russia to defend them.
Yeah, I was asking a little bit about their ability to hold the ground, because one of the theories that had been told to me by one of the reporters from the Times is that Ukrainian, his sources were saying, Maxim Toka's sources were saying that Ukrainians are very firmly got their eyes on the US elections, and that would be of interest is take and hold as much ground as possible in anticipation, because they are convinced, or the ones that he's spoken to, that Donald Trump will be the next president, and there will be some kind of peace deal that may be forced upon. And this is a race against time to reset the boundaries, if, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly possible. I mean, it would be a bold gambit if that were true, given how far in advance we are of a potential Trump presidency. Even if he were to win the election, we're talking another 5 months before he would be in position. And so a Ukrainian operation launched now to capture as much ground as possible, to potentially trade it back for example, bits of the Donbass, that would require quite considerable reinforcement. And up until now, the Ukrainian modus operandi on the ground has been to ensure that the exchange rate of losses is as unfavorable to Russia as possible. I mean, Russia's been essentially doing that itself with how it's been advancing at the moment, but they can take those losses for some months yet, whereas the Ukrainians can't. So I wouldn't rule out essentially a gambit to seize territory that could later be traded away. But it's going to be a tall order to consolidate and hold it throughout the winter to be in a position to affect those later negotiations.
If we could just talk a little bit now about some of the successes that Ukrainian forces have had with their drones in recent days. This offensive included a reported first-person view FPV drone strike, bringing down a Russian Mi-28 attack helicopter, according to a source in the Ukrainian SBU security services. What does that tell us about the evolving capabilities of the Ukrainian drone operators?
So I think we've seen some interesting, if you like, aerial combat or less aerial combat, but aerial use of drones on both sides. So we've seen those images. I think the first of essentially an FPV drone bringing down a helicopter in flight. We're also seeing an increasing number of examples of both sides using FPV and other kind of loitering munitions against each other's drones. And so, for example, there's been a recent spate of some of the Ukrainian drones that, if you like, drop weapons on Russian forces. There's video of them being struck by Russian loitering munitions and drones. I think it's another example of the both the proliferation of different types and more proficient use by the operators in those drones to an extent that would probably overmatch anything that you say the UK has got at the moment. Like the experience that is being built up amongst drone operators on both sides in essentially using small racing drones or modified commercial drones to strike moving military targets is pretty impressive. It does also show that there is still this background electronic warfare battle going on. So various drone types have come into use and then been jammed or rendered obsolete. If the Ukrainians have advanced this far into Russia and are using their FPV drones on Russian territory, they've clearly found some way to counter local Russian jamming and electronic warfare.
I'm also really interested to hear your take on the attack, which you mentioned briefly earlier, on the airfield, the Morozovsk in the Rostov Oblast. It was an audacious attack, and although it has been attacked before, it's the extent of the attack and the damage that's done that's interesting in this particular attack. What can you tell us about the growing sense of confidence and capability there?
So I think this goes to the heart of there's both a big picture value in these as well as the tactical one. The big picture is that this is the other way that the Ukrainians have been keeping the Russians on the back foot and demonstrating that they have got an ability to reach out and hit Russia where it hurts. So some of the stuff that's been closest to the front line has been ammunition supply depots, some of the fuel or rail depots where supplies get moved into Russian forces, but also Russian infrastructure and deeper targets, and striking the air bases. And they've gone extremely far north. We're talking over 1,000 kilometers in some cases to hit large Russian bomber bases. That is both about keeping the Russians aware that the war can come home to them. But that is also about trying to do something about the Russian air campaign aimed at Ukrainian infrastructure, as well as their ground forces, because they have obviously got Patriot and Iris-T and other systems provided by the West. But the cheapest way of dealing with those Russian air threats is to destroy the aircraft on the ground before they take off. So destroying a target like that, and it does appear that they cause significant damage to both ammunition supply and aircraft parked on the ground, is really of benefit both presentationally and in terms of the conduct of the war. And it's also worth noting that they do this in various directions, because what you've got there is turning the length of the front into a disadvantage for the Russians, which is that they've now got to think about where they place their air defense systems across an enormous frontage, because effectively, although ground forces can't get there, the Russians are now having to assume that almost anything that's within, say, 1,000 miles of the Ukrainian front line in all directions could be a target for drones.
If we could just return to the invasion in the Kursk Oblast, President Putin's response was very quick, notably quick. Do you think that this has unnerved him? Do you think there's a bit of a panic going on in the Kremlin?
I mean, I don't really know what unnerves Putin, but it will certainly be uncomfortable to the military leadership, because in essence, their narrative has been, constant progress, limited threats, and the Ukrainians essentially are the ones who should be suing for peace and accepting terms that are put onto them. And I think this will induce a little bit of doubt in the minds of some, as well as just frankly embarrassing the system. And there are some movements going on behind the scenes at the moment where we're beginning to see military officers moved around, officials being picked up for corruption. I think there is unease in the Russian military system as to how effective they are. And even if this is a time-limited operation, the fact that they were able to move across the border, threaten a major area, do so publicly, capture Russian soldiers, it will just create, again, additional doubt in the Russian mind. I mean, I think it's worth going back to the Wagner insurrection. The general view is that when that took place, if Prigozhin and the lead elements of that force had pressed on, having bypassed most of the ground forces and the kind of deals that they had made, it was eminently possible for them to drive almost to Moscow unchallenged. Now, no one's suggesting that this is a Ukrainian ground operation that could conduct a similar penetration, but it does just create a little bit of concern in Russian military planners about exactly how deep their defenses are and where their vulnerabilities are. So I think, I mean, it does feel very strongly like this operation might be more significant politically and in kind of presentational terms and changing the narrative than it will be necessarily tactically. Notwithstanding, as I said, we don't know how this will play out. And we could be looking back in a month at a limited operation and saying how audacious and successful it was. Similarly, we might look back and the Ukrainians might have got themselves tangled up in something that causes them to take additional losses that they really needed for next year.
So just finally, what will you be looking for in the coming hours and days?
So I think there's a question about how reserves are moved. I think there will be a question of the extent to which the Russian Air Force is involved in suppressing these ground forces. And I think there will be some interest in whether the Ukrainians move up more forces to consolidate, particularly on some of the higher ground, or bring up artillery to strike into, for example, some of the supply lines and routes that they might be able to cover. As I said, I think there is concern about whether the Ukrainians have enough to consolidate in strength. But you would expect to see there are some excellent analysts out there picking out signs of some of their additional artillery forces moving up and whether or not they begin to dig in and consolidate.
Matthew Savill, it's been great talking to you. Thank you very much for your time.
No problem.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.